During the 18th and 19th centuries, Russia underwent a profound cultural transformation, and the use of French by the nobility became one of the most fascinating aspects of this era. To understand the context behind this phenomenon, we need to go back to the reign of Peter the Great, who ruled Russia from 1682 to 1725. Peter had a grand vision for his country. He wanted to modernize Russia and transform it into a European power. Inspired by the journeys he took through Western Europe, Peter sought to bring what he considered to be the best cultural and technological practices of the West to Russia. To achieve this, he introduced drastic reforms, not only in government but also in the customs and culture of the nobility. He encouraged the court and aristocracy to adopt European manners, dress according to Western fashions, and learn foreign languages, especially French, which at the time was considered the language of diplomacy and refined culture. Over time, French not only became popular among Russian nobles but also a language of prestige. In the 18th century, during the reign of Catherine the Great, this phenomenon intensified. Catherine was an empress born in Germany, but she adopted Russia as her homeland and sought to strengthen the country's cultural connections with Europe. Although she never lost touch with Russian culture, Catherine had a great appreciation for French culture and often corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot. The influence of French culture over the Russian court grew to the point that French became the main language used by the nobility for conversation, writing, and even intellectual discussions. This preference for French was, in part, a way for the Russian aristocracy to distinguish itself from the rest of the population, who still spoke predominantly Russian and lived much simpler lives. Speaking French was a symbol of sophistication and belonging to the European cultural elite. The French language was taught in the best schools, and many young nobles were sent to study in France or had French tutors. In many aristocratic families, it was common for children to learn French before Russian, and some could barely speak Russian fluently. Thus, for Russian nobles, French was not just a language but a symbol of status, education, and refinement. During the reign of Alexander I, the influence of French reached its peak. Alexander I, who ruled from 1801 to 1825, was a czar with a complex relationship with Europe, especially with France. At the beginning of his reign, Alexander was a great admirer of French ideas, particularly those of the Enlightenment. However, this admiration was shaken by the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and, later, by the French invasion of Russia in 1812. This event was a landmark in Russian history, not only for Napoleon's defeat but also for the cultural impact it had on the nobility. After the invasion, many Russians began to question their fascination with France and the adoration for French culture. The war brought a resurgence of Russian nationalism and a renewed appreciation for Russian culture and language. Many members of the aristocracy who had grown up speaking French began to learn Russian or take an interest in the literature and traditions of their own country. This movement is visible in writers of the time, like Alexander Pushkin, who is considered the father of modern Russian literature and wrote in Russian, although he was also fluent in French. Nevertheless, despite growing nationalism, French continued to be widely used by the nobility throughout the 19th century, especially for letters, documents, and diaries. Russian authors such as Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, who criticized the nobility and their fascination with the West, reflected this cultural ambivalence in their works. In Tolstoy's masterpiece, War and Peace, there are several passages written in French, highlighting the influence of this language on the aristocracy and how French was the language of daily interactions among noble characters. Tolstoy uses French as a literary device to show the cultural alienation of the nobility from the Russian people. For him, this obsession with French culture was a way of distancing from true Russian identity. Additionally, the use of French represented the tension between admiration for European cultural sophistication and the need to assert a Russian national identity. Over time, the Russian language gained more space among the aristocracy, especially as nationalist ideas strengthened in Russia. The intellectual movement known as Slavophilism, which advocated for the appreciation of Russian culture and tradition, opposed Westernism, which encouraged the imitation of European customs and ideas. The influence of these debates contributed to the gradual decline of French, although it remained a prestigious language at court and among the wealthiest families. The Revolution of 1917 marked the end of widespread French use by the nobility, as the Russian aristocracy was practically abolished, and the new Soviet authorities condemned everything that reminded them of the old order. The use of French came to be associated with the former regime and the inequalities it represented. Nevertheless, the period when French was the language of the Russian nobility left a deep mark on the country's culture. Through this language, Russia absorbed and reinterpreted aspects of European thought and literature, while also experiencing cultural identity conflicts that helped shape Russian nationalism.